Tom stepped between them, his hands raised. "You boys need to leave. Now." His voice was firm, but there was a hint of desperation. He'd seen Jake snap once before, not here, but years ago when some drifter pulled a knife during a heated argument outside the same garage. Jake didn't even hesitate. The fight was over before it started, and the guy left in an ambulance. No charges were pressed, self-defense, they said, but Tom never forgot how fast Jake moved, how precise, like it was second nature. But Ryan wasn't smart enough to take the warning. "We'll leave when we're good and ready," he shot back, glancing around for an audience, feeding off the attention. Meanwhile, across the street, Sarah watched from the diner window. She'd known Jake for a while, brought in coffee almost every morning. Sarah watched from the diner window, her fingers wrapped tightly around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. She'd known Jake for years, never much more than polite small talk over coffee and quick exchanges when she brought in her old car for repairs. But she'd always sensed there was more to him, something hidden beneath the quiet demeanor and the haunted look in his eyes. Now, as she saw the confrontation unfolding, her instincts screamed that this wasn't just some petty argument. This was a fuse burning toward an explosion. Back in the garage, Ryan's crew was getting bolder, fueled by ego and the false courage that comes from having an audience. One of the guys, a lanky kid named Kyle, picked up a metal pipe from the workbench, twirling it in his hand like it was a toy. "What's the matter, big guy?" "Scared," he sneered, stepping closer. The clanking of tools and the faint hum of an engine running in the background made the tension unbearable. Jake didn't move. His eyes flicked to the pipe, then back to Ryan, calculating. He wasn't afraid, not of them, not the situation. But he was holding back, fighting an inner battle far more dangerous than the one brewing in front of him. He'd spent years learning how to control his instincts, how to shut off the part of him trained to react without hesitation. But control has its limits. Tom's voice broke through the tension again. "You boys don't know what you're doing. Walk away while you still can." Ryan laughed, stepping right up to Jake, his face inches away. What's he gonna do? Fix us with a wrench? For a moment, time seemed to slow. Jake's breathing was steady, his gaze unwavering. But his stance shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. A shift in weight, the slight tension in his shoulders, the calm before the storm. Sarah had seen enough. She dropped the mug, the shatter echoing in the empty diner, and sprinted across the street, her heart racing. She didn't know what she was going to do, only that she had to do something before it was too late. But it was already too late. Ryan made the mistake that would tip everything over the edge. He swung the pipe. And that's when Jake finally moved. The pipe sliced through the air with a sharp whoosh, aimed straight at Jake's head. But before it could land, Jake moved. Fast, faster than anyone in the garage could process. His hand shot up, gripping the pipe mid-swing with effortless precision. The force of the blow should have knocked him back, but he stood like a wall, unmoving, his fingers wrapped tightly around the cold metal. Ryan's smug grin vanished, replaced by wide-eyed disbelief. Jake didn't say a word. He twisted his wrist slightly, and the pipe clattered to the floor, slipping from Kyle's trembling fingers. In one fluid motion, Jake stepped forward, his presence alone forcing the group to stumble back. But just as it seemed like the confrontation was reaching its breaking point, a sudden shout echoed from the garage entrance. "Jake, don't." Everyone turned to see a man standing in the doorway, rugged, wearing a faded military jacket, his face weathered by time and experience. His name was Cole, another retired Navy SEAL, and someone Jake hadn't seen in years. Their past was buried deep, tied to missions neither of them liked to talk about. The sight of him was like a ghost walking in broad daylight, and for the first time, Jake's expression cracked. Ryan and his crew, confused but sensing an opportunity, regained their false confidence. "What's this?" "A reunion of old war buddies." Ryan mocked, stepping closer again, emboldened by Jake's brief hesitation. But Cole wasn't there to reminisce. His eyes locked onto Jake's, sharp and filled with a warning. "They're not worth it," he said quietly, but with enough weight to cut through the tension. "Don't go back to that place." Jake's fists clenched at his sides, his muscles coiled like springs. He wasn't just fighting Ryan and his crew anymore. He was fighting himself, his past, and everything he'd buried under years of quiet living. The garage felt smaller now, the air thick with more than just the heat of confrontation. The garage was buzzing with the usual sounds of clanking tools and revving engines. In the middle of it all stood Jake, a towering man with broad shoulders and calloused hands, effortlessly tightening bolts on an old truck. His presence was commanding, but his demeanor was quiet, almost reserved. Most people in town knew him as the giant mechanic who kept their cars running, but no one really knew much about his past. He never talked about it, and no one asked. That afternoon, a group of young men strutted into the shop, laughing loudly, that energy radiating arrogance. They weren't here for car trouble. They were here for trouble itself. One of them, a wiry guy with a cocky smirk, nudged his friend and motioned toward Jake. "Look at this big guy," he scoffed. "What's he gonna do? Crush a wrench?" The others chuckled, feeding off each other's bravado. Jake barely glanced up, unfazed by the taunts. He had dealt with men like this before years ago, in places far more dangerous than a dusty old garage. But he wasn't interested in conflict, not anymore. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and went back to work. That only encouraged them. One of the thugs stepped closer, knocking a toolbox over with a loud clang. "Oops," he grinned. "Clumsy me." Another one snatched a wrench from the counter and tossed it between his hands. "Hey, big guy, you gonna stop us?" The air in the shop grew heavy, the kind of tension that made the other customers inch away. But Jake still didn't react. Not yet. He was giving them a choice, a way out. But they didn't take it. The leader of the group took a step too far, reaching for Jake's shoulder. And in that instant, everything changed. What these punks didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly guessed, was that Jake wasn't just a mechanic. He was a retired Navy SEAL, and the skills he had once used to survive the most dangerous missions in the world, he still had them. They were about to find out the hard way. Jake didn't flinch when the thug's hand landed on his shoulder. For a split second, the garage fell into complete silence. The only sound was the faint creak of the overhead fans spinning lazily. Jake slowly straightened up, his towering frame casting a shadow over the young man who had made the mistake of thinking size was all he had to offer. His piercing blue eyes finally met the thug's, calm but sharp, like the stillness before a storm. The group of punks exchanged glances, their cocky grins starting to fade, but they weren't smart enough to back down. "What's the matter, old man?" The leader sneered, trying to cover up his growing nerves. "You think you're tough just 'cause you're big." Jake didn't respond with words. He didn't need to. His silence was heavier than any threat could be. But before things could escalate, an older man from across the garage, Tom, the shop's owner, stepped in. "Hey, that's enough." Tom's voice was gruff, filled with both authority and a hint of fear. Not fear of Jake, but fear of what might happen if these kids pushed him too far. Tom had known Jake for years. He didn't know the full story, but he knew enough. There was a reason Jake preferred engines over people. Engines didn't provoke you. They didn't test how far you could be pushed. The thugs backed off slightly, pretending they weren't rattled, but their bravado was fading fast. Still, they weren't ready to walk away, not yet. As they lingered, the story behind Jake quietly unfolded in the background. Years ago, he wasn't just some mechanic in a small town. He had served in some of the most dangerous places in the world, carrying out missions most people couldn't even imagine. He had been part of covert operations, surviving situations where failure wasn't an option. But after years of living on the edge, he wanted peace, a simple life. Fixing cars gave him that, until now. The thugs didn't know any of this. To them, Jake was just a giant with grease-stained hands. But they were about to learn that the quietest man in the room often has the loudest past. The tension hung in the air like thick smoke, refusing to clear. The leader of the group, a guy named Ryan, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him, not in front of his crew. He shoved Jake's shoulder harder this time, his grin forced, masking the uncertainty in his eyes. "What's the matter, tough guy? Cat got your tongue?" Jake's jaw tightened slightly, but his expression remained unreadable. Inside, though, a storm was brewing. Not anger, control. Years of discipline taught him that real strength wasn't in how fast you reacted, but in how long you could hold back. He wasn't afraid of these kids. He was afraid of himself, of what he could do if he let go. Later that night, Jake sat alone on the back steps of the garage, staring at the stars. Cole joined him, 2 beers in hand. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. After a long silence, Jake finally spoke. "I thought I left that life behind." Cole took a sip, then shrugged. "The past doesn't care where you go. It just waits." Jake nodded slowly, the words sinking in. But as he looked out at the quiet town he'd tried to call home, he realized something. Maybe you can't outrun your past, but you can choose what you do when it catches up. The next morning, the garage reopened like nothing had happened. Cars came in, engines needed fixing, and life moved on. Jake picked up his wrench, wiped the grease from his hands, and got back to work. Because sometimes, the strongest thing a man can do isn't fighting the battles behind him. It's choosing to live beyond them. But then, just as things seemed to shift, a black SUV screeched to a halt outside the garage. The doors flew open, and men in dark clothes spilled out, armed, moving with precision. This wasn't random. They weren't here for Ryan and his crew. They were here for Jake. And suddenly, the thugs who thought they were picking on a mechanic realized they were standing in the middle of something far more dangerous than they ever imagined. The screech of tires was like a gunshot, freezing everyone in place. The black SUV skidded to a halt, and the doors burst open. 4 men spilled out, dressed in tactical gear, faces cold, movements sharp, not the kind of guys who stumbled into trouble by accident. They moved with a precision Jake recognized immediately. These weren't random thugs. They were professionals, and they were here for him. Jake's instincts kicked in before his mind could catch up. He grabbed Ryan by the collar and yanked him to the ground just as the first man raised his weapon. A shot rang out, shattering the air, and the front window of the garage. Chaos erupted. Ryan's crew scattered like frightened kids, all traces of bravado gone in an instant. Cole dove for cover behind a workbench, pulling a small pistol from his jacket. "Jake, they're here for you," he shouted, though Jake already knew. His past had finally caught up with him. Jake didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. Years of SEAL training surged through his veins like muscle memory. He sprinted low and fast, closing the distance between him and the first attacker before the man could adjust his aim. A swift elbow to the jaw, a twist of the wrist, and the gun clattered to the floor. Jake kicked it out of reach, then spun to face the next threat. Bullets tore through the garage, hitting metal and shattering glass, but Jake and Cole moved like shadows, ducking and weaving with precision. Ryan, frozen in disbelief, huddled behind an overturned tool cart, realizing for the first time how out of his depth he truly was. Within minutes, the fight was over. The attackers lay disarmed and groaning on the floor, while Jake stood over them, chest heaving, eyes blazing, not with rage, but with the weight of everything he'd tried to leave behind. Tom peeked from behind a stack of tires, wide-eyed. "Jake, what the hell was that?" Before Jake could answer, one of the injured men coughed out a chilling sentence. "This isn't over. They know where you are now." Jake's jaw tightened. He thought he'd escaped this life, but the past had other plans, and as he glanced out the shattered window, seeing Sarah watching from across the street, he realized something even worse. His quiet life wasn't the only thing in danger anymore. The war he thought he'd left behind had just followed him home. The garage was a mess, shattered glass, scattered tools, and the faint smell of gunpowder lingering in the air. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. Jake stood there, hands resting on his knees, catching his breath. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a familiar emptiness he hadn't felt in years. Coe approached, sliding his pistol back into his jacket. "You can't stay here, Jake.